I think before I start, I want to say that Paul does a great service for Hong Kong in his own way, because you need people like that to rouse, debates and awareness about things, and I think every city needs somebody like that. So that's a good thing. Today's discussion on public open space and private developments is something I think very important, and we need to be speaking about open space in general as well. It's not just public open space and private developments, but I know today's discussion is tailored to this. Okay, what I'm going to do is just briefly go over what generally makes open space successful, and then look at some international examples and local examples and a little bit brief response to the guidelines. This is from PPS, which you can go and look at. They do quite a lot of good work, but the only place I think I would disagree with them is they don't consider design as important. But I think design is important as well. I think public space, to be successful, the image and identity of the place is very important. And I agree with Chris totally, and you're doing great work at Star Street. And I think Swire should be, commended for that as well. So the image and identity is important, where people get attracted to actually go there and remember about the place, whether it's within private developments or even regular public open space. And they need to become, attractions and destinations in their own right. And this is Delhi Square in San Francisco, which is quite popular. So spatial configurations becomes important, I think rightly pointed out in the guidelines. And I'll go to some other, my response more specific to the guidelines later. But if you look at the amenities, they are very important. And I think seating is very important, and also having flexible seating. I think in Hong Kong, I think we're still not at that stage where you can leave chairs that can be moved around. I mean, if you put it in India, they probably will disappear the same day. But in Hong Kong, maybe it'll take a little bit more time. But in the US and other places, they're there, and it's all right. So I think we need to get to that stage. But what that does is having steps, places where you can just sit, is important. And I think the first shock I had when I came to Hong Kong from US was I was tired and I just sat down in a mall. And I was approached by somebody who was managing the place and said, "You are not allowed to sit here." And I thought that was really rude. And then I realized why they do that is because of our own city's peculiar situation, where you find that on Sundays and weekends, every place is a sitting place for most of our amas. And I know a lot of people say that this is actually great for Hong Kong, it's its own flavor, character. I agree, and I don't agree also. Because I think on one level, public space is good when it's actually used by a wider cross-section of people. Then it's really successful. And if we feel there are places where our domestic helpers are actually using, and I have helpers and I talk to them, and they tell me they have no other place to go. That's why they go there. And so something tells us that maybe we need to take care of about them also. And I think that has an implication on how we treat our public space and operations in Hong Kong. And when we get into flexible design, I think this is very, very important. It's not being very rigid. Different things can happen at different times of the day. If it's a larger space, more activities can happen. If it's a smaller space, more quieter things. And another thing is seasonal strategy in normal public spaces. But again, if it's part of a private development but large enough, it could have its own seasonal activities. And access is the most important. So you can have as large a public space as you have in a private development. If it's not accessible, to me, it's not public space. That's it. And that should be a requirement. I think access has to be number one. And I don't think I would be as sympathetic as Wallace was saying, that let's forgive and forget. But I think maybe through these guidelines, existing public spaces could be alerted and not penalized, but more, in a way, find a clever way of recognizing public spaces that really work well. Award them. Recognize the developers' efforts in doing things like that, and automatically you'll find other people will join in to make their spaces more accessible and better. It'll take time, but I'm sure it will happen. Another thing is the edge conditions need to be important as well, so that you are drawn into the public space. And again, there need to be connections going in several directions. That will make it even more accessible. Management becomes important. You can have the best looking space you want, but if you cannot use it, then it's not worth it. So that's another important point. Management has to make sure that if it's coined as public space, then it has to be accessible and people need to be able to use it. Again, funding sources, I agree with Roger that there has to be funding for maintenance and continual upkeep of the place, and even for different activities. And if you come to international, I would go to New York first, and I'm glad, I think the consulting team looked at New York, but there are some lessons that we can learn from New York. Actually, even New York took a long time to evolve their building guidelines, their public space guidelines. And what they found that if the guidelines are implemented, it doesn't mean all these spaces are going to be successful. What they found is even with guidelines and the following the guidelines, they've ended up with public spaces, some that work successful, some that do not work. So what they did was they were monitoring continuously public spaces to then revise their guidelines accordingly. So it has been evolving over a long period of time. And I think that's what Hong Kong should do, is actually look at this process of evolution. And again, if you see this slide here, it talks about access. And I think one of the things I find is not clearly identified in the current guidelines is the linkage part. It's talking only about the space and the spatial configuration, but context and linkage is also important. And if you go into seating, again, different forms of seating is important. And I think, and then people should be allowed to sit and use these places. And if you have, because of domestic helpers, we are not doing it, find a solution. Don't say that should become a problem to the normal functioning of the cities, because even they need other places to actually have performance. And in fact, when I was teaching my class in Hong Kong U, I had my students go and study public spaces, including podium spaces and parks. And they came back and reported back that the people that really use our public spaces are domestic helpers. Whether it's a park, whether it's a podium space or anything, they really enjoy, because they have sessions. Even when I walk back home, now I live in Central, I walk from the Peak Tram underneath. And the people there, mornings you find all our older folks doing exercises, Tai Chi and everything. Then at other times you have the Amas actually having social activities, functions and everything, performances. So I think they know how to use public spaces, and I think we can learn from that. And if you go, so seating is important, and in New York you'll find that there are guidelines for everything. They have for seating, they have for steps in terms of measurements and everything. So they've